You're about to learn 3 of the most important things that I have learned this year that I will be carrying into next year in hopes that you can apply these to your next year as well. Welcome back to the show. If you have been listening for a while, you would know that my content typically focuses on religion and theology, but this episode's going to be a little different and be focused on more some practical things that I've learned throughout the year because I think this is important and hopefully it can benefit you in some way. And if you're new here, my name's Cody. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy the episode. So I want to tell you about 3 things that, 3 kind of highlights that I have learned this year that came to mind. And maybe there's more things that are going to be important that I can make videos on in the future. But these are the 3 things that kind of stood out. And I think it's really good to reflect back on our years and see the kinds of things that we can improve, the kinds of ways that we have been unfaithful, or the kinds of ways that we can be more faithful. Because we always want to be attempting to improve ourselves, in faith. We want to be more faithful every single year, every day even. But the new year, I think, is a really good time to do these reflections because, that's kind of the spirit of the new year. And so that's what I was doing. And I have come up with 3 highlights. One is that I have learned to be more productive than ever this year because of various systems that I have learned and then various systems that I've abandoned. Does it mean I'm wonderfully productive all the time? Absolutely not. It just means that I have learned some things that have allowed me to be, I think, more consistently productive than ever in the past. And that's great. The second thing that I'm going to talk about is about reading and how to read more and how I have been able to read more books than I ever thought was possible this year. And then the third thing I want to talk about is about looking for a good church. I talk about that kind of thing all the time on my podcast, as you know, but I've come up with some new, not new, but this year I've come up with some interesting insights that I didn't have previously about looking for a good church. And so we'll get into that. So the first thing to dive in, how I've learned how to be more productive than ever. I want to talk you through some of my kind of strategies and the systems that I use and the things that I don't like, hopefully to improve your productivity in the next year because work is important. We all need to be producing something, even if we work from home or even if we don't have if you're a stay-at-home mom, you still need to be producing things. And a lot of those things that you produce are going to be with your children, but perhaps you want to be producing other things as well. I think these can potentially be helpful for you no matter what you do. So first, I think it's important to know about me that I hate productivity systems. I used to read a ton of productivity books, and if a particularly good one comes along, then I might read that, or if it's highly recommended or whatever, I'll read that. But I think this year I've taken a different look at productivity than I have in the past. And I think one book that I read, I think it was either early this year or last year, was a book called Plodductivity. And that book, it's a Christian book. It's by Doug Wilson. And it's kind of a theology of work and wealth. And it helped me to view work and productivity a little bit differently. And the idea behind Plodductivity is that we ought to be plodding at things. We ought to be plodding away. We ought to be, working, even in small ways, as much as we can. And this idea of plodding, like knocking little tiny bits of stuff out, I think was really helpful for me because one example that Doug gives in the book is that maybe he'll be in a car on a short drive, like even 3 minutes, or maybe he'll be standing in the line at the post office. He uses that opportunity to start an audiobook or to do something else when typically we might just be on our phones goofing off. We could be actually doing something productive, something that will teach us something or something that would allow us to produce something. And that was good. And that's definitely something I could still improve on. But reading that book kind of made me look at work differently, so I highly recommend it. It's a theology of work, and so it's not solely about this productivity system, and it's not even a system at all, but it contains a lot of wisdom from the Bible and Proverbs and other places in the Bible in general about work and what work should be like. So that was great. Also, the book talks about technology and how we now have the ability to outsource our work to technology. So like a long, long, long time ago, people would have big houses, and we're more wealthy than we've ever been right now, living in America or living in the West. We are so wealthy compared to previous generations. And one example of this is that long, long time ago, people would live in, big houses. And part of the reason is because they had a lot of servants. And so maybe the one servant would take care of the babies and another servant might clean the house or whatever. Different people had different jobs. And today we don't necessarily have live-in servants in our house, but we have technology. We go to restaurants to kind of outsource the work of making food. We have phones and like that can send emails and read books for us, and that outsources a different kind of work. And so one really interesting point that I liked in the book, Productivity, was that we have about 10,000 servants in our pocket. And we can either, and not only in our pocket, I'm not just talking about phones, but just the vast array of things and technology and other things that we have access to, more than we ever have. And so we need to ask ourselves, are we utilizing those tools well? And thinking about that and thinking about what my phone can do and what my computer can do and whatever else I have has been very valuable for me to think about how can I utilize the tools that I have more efficiently to do better work. And so I want to talk about some of those tools that I have. One of the tools, some of them are technology, but this one is just a book. It's called a bullet journal. And I've actually used this one bullet journal over many years. And I think I'm retiring it this year because I've gotten something else that can essentially be identical to a bullet journal, but it's a little more customizable. It's called a traveler's notebook. And if you want to look into more details on what these things are, you can watch them. There's tons of videos out there for both of these things. But the bullet journal is kind of, and you could use any journal, it doesn't have to be this particular book. But the idea behind a bullet journal is that it's like a organization system, I would say. And so one of the most interesting things that I had never thought of before in a bullet journal is that in the front page, there's an index, just like there would be like a glossary in a regular book. And as you're filling out the book, all the pages are empty. As you have different things throughout the book, you can go back and add to your index, like this meeting happened on page 25. And you can write details about the meeting in the index and then reference the actual meeting on the page. And so even though your notes are going to be in different places on the book, so maybe one chunk of notes is going to be here and maybe the remainder of that chunk of notes is going to be somewhere else in the book, you can organize all of that in the index and have a quick way to look through the book instead of just maybe with a regular notebook, you just have a bunch of information and it's chaotic to get through. So a bullet journal really helps organize that. And then there's also things that a bullet journal can do that also a regular journal could do if you know the system, where you can organize your days and your weeks and your to-do lists. Really the possibilities are endless. But I'm not a huge fan of organizing everything in a planner or a notebook. I think we have access to technology, and so we should use it because a lot of that technology is built specifically to do this kind of thing more efficiently. I think it is still really beneficial for me to be able to write some stuff down. And this book is full. I've been using it for years. Mainly I have used this book, the bullet journal, for meetings, organizing meetings. Like back when I was a youth pastor in those regrettable days, I every time I had a meeting, I wrote notes about the meeting in this book. And then if I were to meet with that person again in the future, I could reference our previous meeting, remember what we talked about. Maybe there were prayer requests or whatever. I could reference all those and I could keep that in mind. But I would also use this book for other things. A couple of pieces of technology that I've really started using and I think are really helpful for me this year. One is Google Calendar. And that might sound cheesy, like, well, of course everybody knows about Google Calendar. It specifically this thing called time blocking, which you can look up this idea and use this if you'd like. But it's the idea of kind of scheduling your entire day, even if it's rest time or whatever. So if you have a consistent schedule, you could say, wake up and go to the gym this time to this time. Even if you do that every single day, and I don't need to remind myself, I need to get up and go to the gym. That's not what the calendar's for. The time blocking on the calendar is a useful tool so that you can see how well you're using your time. And if you have something else to fit in, maybe you're not shuffling things around throughout your day, you know what you can say yes to, you know what you can say no to. That's been helpful for me. And it's also been helpful for me to see if it helps me schedule my rest time, and it helps me schedule my various other things that I have to do throughout the day. So it's really interesting. That's an interesting idea. You can look up time blocking. And another tool that I use a lot is called Notion. Notion is amazing. There are a lot of other kind of organizational tools. You may have heard of something like Evernote. That one's a super popular one. You might have heard of Trello or Todoist. Each of these tools kind of has one specialization. Trello is really good at doing, what is it called? It's something board. Trello is really good at this one thing. Todoist is really good at to-do lists. Apple Reminders, for example, is really good at also to-do lists. And I've started using that now as well, Apple Reminders, on my iPhone. But Notion is cool because it does everything that all of those other programs do. And maybe in some cases not quite as well, but it's all in one space. And so I've tried using Evernote and Trello and Todoist and all these other things, but it gets kind of tedious once you have so many things in so many places. I don't want to have to open up this app over here and then go somewhere else and open up this other app. I would really like them all in one place and have kind of a dashboard where I can view all of those things. And that's Notion. Now, if you look up Notion, it's going to be kind of complicated to get into because you have to essentially build your own pages. But no, and it can do like spreadsheets, it can do to-do lists, it can do those cardboards that Trello does, and it can do a lot of other really cool things too. But there's a little bit of a steeper learning curve than there is with those other softwares. But for me, it's been absolutely worth it. I store my invoices for work on Notion. I have spreadsheets. I store projects I'm working on. I write my podcast scripts. I'm actually looking at notes for this podcast right here in Notion right now. So I store all my podcast information. I can store my logos and my music and whatever. I don't know how much space you're allowed to have on Notion, but I haven't used it all up yet. And I've been using Notion for like the whole year almost. And it's been wonderful. So Notion is excellent for organization, for tracking things, even book notes, which I'll talk more about later. I keep all that in Notion. Notion's been great for me. And so those are the kinds of tools that I have learned to be more productive this year than I ever have in the past, and more organized too. So I hope that helped. The second thing that I have learned that's been a really important highlight of my year is that reading isn't that hard. By the end of the year, I will have read over one book a week. Now, to some of you, that might not sound like much at all. And then to some of you, that might sound like some kind of unachievable goal. But reading this year has been really important to me. And, it's always been important to me. I just hated reading. And I've had periods sometimes where I, read a couple books a week or, read more than other times. But typically I would read very little, like a few books a year, maybe a handful. But this year was different. I made a goal, and my wife really helped me do this because she has been doing she's given herself a reading goal for, I think, 3 years now. This is the third year in a row where she's had a reading goal for herself. And so her goal this year was 75, and she's going to hit it. And my goal was just 52, one book a week, and I will have hit my goal. And it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. And so I want to give you some tips about reading more, if that's something that's important to you. And if not, then you can apply these strategies to whatever else you enjoy that you want to do more of. So one thing that has really helped me to read more is, one, to have that same goal as my wife. No matter what the goal is, if you want to go to the gym more, or if you want to read more or do anything more, it's really, really helpful to have a partner to motivate each other. And it's even more helpful if it's your spouse. And that's been huge for me. Another thing that really helps me to read is once or twice a week, we typically go somewhere dedicated to read, because I actually find it really difficult to read in my own house. So sometimes we go to the library, which I've also been kind of awakened to how cool libraries are in the past couple of years. There's a lot of things not cool about libraries in terms of the content that they approve of and share and push on people. But there is a lot of cool things about libraries in that it's a really peaceful environment, usually for you to just sit and hang out and study. And a lot of libraries, at least in our area, are very nice. And they're just great environments for studying or reading. And so sometimes for work, I go to the library and I get some work done. Or other times, my wife and I go to the library and we read that evening because it's a really nice environment. And when we don't go to a library, sometimes we go to a coffee shop. Whenever we don't want to spend the money, we go to the library. Whenever we don't mind, then we go to a coffee shop. And then we sit there for, an hour or hour and a half, and then we read. And then we try to do that once or twice a week. Now, that's not much. So I also read a lot of audiobooks, or listen to them. If you count that as reading or not, I do. So audiobooks have been incredibly helpful too. And speaking of libraries, this is something that my wife does a lot more than me. But there's an app called Libby. And what Libby does is it basically allows you, as far as I know, maybe it does more than this, but you can check out audiobooks and ebooks from your library, and it puts it on your phone. You can read it on your phone, you can read it on your Kindle, and you can listen to the audiobooks also through Libby. And it's great. And you have access to audiobooks, and you don't even need to buy them. And you can listen to them straight away because you check them out from the library, and you get to keep them for as long as you can keep a library book. It's awesome. So Libby has been huge. And speaking of Kindle, Kindle's another thing that helps me read. I kind of go through these phases of appreciating my Kindle more and less. I used to live in Japan, and I kind of bought my Kindle at first by necessity. I hated the idea of reading ebooks. I love the feeling of paper books. I hate it like it's not even reading is what I thought if you're reading an ebook. How could anybody want to read that? Because reading on my iPhone is so terrible. Well, the Kindle is like a totally different experience. The Kindle is awesome to read on. I bought it, like I said, when I lived in Japan because I couldn't really easily order books for myself or read a lot of books. You can't just go to a bookstore and buy a book in English in Japan. It was very difficult. And so I read all my books on my Kindle. And that's when I first got it, and it was great. I still have the same Kindle. It was many years ago. So those things are built like bricks. They're built to last. They are awesome little things. And I have a really old Kindle. I wish I brought it to show you. But I just have one of the old Paperwhites from like 6 years ago. And it still is great. My wife recently bought a newer Kindle, and I'm still totally satisfied with my old one, which is pretty uncharacteristic of me because I typically like to get the newest thing if it is improved upon from the last one. But my old Kindle is totally fine, and it helps me read a lot, and I can get books on it from the library. I don't have to buy them. I don't have to wait on Amazon, which means I can get more books that I want instead of thinking like, do I want to buy this new book? It's expensive. I don't want to buy new books all the time on Amazon, mainly because the price really adds up if you do that all the time. I do still buy plenty of books on Amazon, but Libby and the Kindle have been excellent for reading more books that I'm excited to read. And another thing is an app called Canon Plus, and they have tons of audiobooks. It's a subscription, but it's super cheap. It's absolutely worth it. You should check out Canon Plus, and there's wonderful books on it, like the audiobook for Plot-Activity, the book that I mentioned earlier. There's also, I wanted to mention how I kind of make notes in books to try to memorize what's in them. So this is kind of related. Now, some books, I recently finished The Silmarillion, and it's torn up, but, just because that's what happens with big books when you read them. Some books I don't write notes in, and I don't mark up, and Silmarillion is one of them. I didn't want to mess the inside of this book up so that other people can read it for kind of, what it's worth in the future if I ever want to lend it or have someone else read it in my family in the future. But other books I make notes in. So one book that I'm currently going through is The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I want to show you an example of my indexing system. I think I got this from Tim Ferriss, because I used to listen to Tim Ferriss a lot many years ago. And so some books I make notes in the book. And some books I make notes in on Notion. That's where I track my reading list, what books I want to read, what books maybe I want to buy, or recommendations that I get. And all the books that I finish or are currently reading, I sometimes write notes about those books or things that stood out to me. And that's really good. But when I don't want to write those notes in Notion, I write them in the book. And so I'm going to show you kind of my indexing system for writing in books. Now, some of you are going to think that it's one of the worst things ever that I write in books. I think some books I would never want to write in, and some books I don't mind at all. And so this is one of the books that I wanted to take notes in. So let me show you my indexing system. In most books, there are going to be some mostly blank pages or pages with a lot of space in the beginning of the book. And so I kind of create my own index for my notes. And you'll see here, I just have a few things written down so far. But on this page and the next page is totally blank. I can fill up if I want to with notes from the book. So here's what happens. As I'm reading the book and I stumble across something that I really like on this page 44 and 45, I might make notes on the page as you would, or underline things or whatever, which is what you would typically do. But the problem with just doing that is whenever you go through your book and you're trying to find something that you highlighted that stood out to you a long time ago, you can't find it. You have to flip through all the pages. You have to look for your notes. And if you wrote a lot of notes or you underlined a lot of things, it's going to be really, really hard to find those things. And so what I have done is I've created an index in the beginning of a lot of my books, and I have written a brief sentence for why that thing on that page stood out to me. So for example, on page 44, I wrote, torture was illegal, but torture was still used. And so then when you turn to page 44, I can see all of my notes that I underlined and wrote about what was happening on this page about torture, and then I can read the fuller context. And so this just makes it a lot easier for you to reference things in books that you've read. And then ultimately remember the things that you've read, because that's important. What's the use of reading a book a week if you can't remember anything? So at the very least, I like to pick up a few main ideas from the books. But if it's a more dense book like The Gulag Archipelago, I like to have a lot more notes in the books, and that's been super helpful. So that was the second thing. That's how I've learned to appreciate reading more and to learn that reading isn't really that hard. I think I mentioned that I listen to a lot of audiobooks. I do what the book Plot-Activity says, which is I listen to audiobooks quite a bit. I listen when I'm out walking the dog. I listen sometimes on the way to and from the gym or just at home, or when I'm doing chores around the house or cooking or whatever. And so that's an opportunity to listen to audiobooks. Also, another interesting thing is that I listen to audiobooks on somewhere between usually 1.5 and 2.0 speed. So I speed the book up. Depending on the reader, some readers read very fast, some are slower, and so I can adjust the speed to kind of be almost to the point where I can't understand them. And if I'm still hearing what they say, our thoughts we think faster than we speak. Our thoughts are much quicker than our words. So if we're reading a book out loud, we're going to read the book slower than if we're reading it in our heads. And so I think speeding up audiobooks is a really good opportunity for us to kind of match the reading of the book with how fast we think. And so that's another way of how I get through audiobooks quickly and still be able to understand them. So the third thing is what I've learned about finding churches. This is more typical Spare No Arrows content. So the first thing, here's just kind of a 2-for-1 deal on these things that I've learned. One, it is nearly impossible to find a church. If you listen back through the show, I've always said that it is possible to find a church. They're out there, but they're rare. It seems like every year I am realizing it's harder and harder to find a church than I previously thought. Not that it's getting harder, but that the whole time it's been this hard, and my mind is coming to finally fit in with how hard it actually really is. And I think it is nearly impossible to find a faithful church. Now, sometimes we want to compromise. Sometimes that may be okay. Although, I'm still working through that. Maybe it's never okay to compromise and go to a bad church. Unless you maybe have been going to the church and you have some kind of power to do something about it. But it's a lot harder than I thought it was previously to find a church. I think many people go to bad churches and they're totally content, either because they're ignorant that the church is bad or that they know and they just don't care. Because, going to church is important. Although, I don't think it's important to go to bad churches. I think that's, you're probably doing more harm to yourself than good if you're compromising and going to a bad church. So my advice to you would be, if you are going to a bad church, get out and don't let that mess with your conscience. You're enabling bad ministry, and you are absorbing bad preaching if you're going to bad churches. It's as simple as that. But also, I think some people actually know what makes a bad church, but they still go to bad churches. And I think that was me in some cases. Like at some point, in the past few years, I knew this isn't a great church, but I'm going to go here because we have friends here, or we have people that I'm attempting to be friends with, or whatever. And ultimately, it hasn't ever a single time been worth it. Because if going to a good church is important, why would you spend any time at all going to a bad church? Even if there were people there that you liked. Because who cares? You're going to find more people that you like somewhere else. And those people that you like, they are content with going to a bad church. And so your values aren't even lined up if you are staying at a church because you like people there, because you don't share obviously the same deep, important religious values, because they think it's a fine church, you think it's not. So either you both should leave if you do have the same values, or recognize that it's probably not good to be friends with people who don't share your same values, right? But also, I think some people, maybe they're willing to compromise in certain ways. Like, overall, this is a good church, but they do a few things I don't like. And maybe one of these things is pretty bad, but I'm going to compromise because there's no other churches in my area. And I think that was me. We compromised with a couple of churches that was like, we think it's a good church, but overall, but then there are a couple of these maybe potentially major things, but, we're going to give them grace on this. Bad idea. Didn't turn out well. And ultimately, if something major is happening bad in the church and everything else about the church is good, it's probably a bad church still. And I can talk more about that in future episodes. But here's the second thing I learned about finding churches. It is possible to find a good church. So the first thing was, it is nearly impossible to find a good church. But the second note is, but it is possible. And I think I found a good church. but it was really hard to find. I have to drive every week 40 minutes to get to church. And I thought I was a weirdo going to this church because it was so far away, but it seems like everybody else, they drive just about that far too. We're not driving the farthest, and we're definitely not. It seems like we're probably not even in the minority, because a lot of people drive a long way to get to this church. That's how important it is to find a good church, to me and these other people. Now, are you required to drive 40 minutes to go to church? I think that's up to you. You can do that if you want. But if there's literally no churches that you believe are actually faithful, biblically faithful in your area, then I think that's morally acceptable not to go. I think God does want us to gather in churches, but also I think, gathering in a bad church, gathering in a church that is harmful to your soul is not good. And God doesn't want us to do that. So that said, and I've said this before, if there are no faithful churches in your area, you should keep looking. You should start one, or you should find someone who can. And, that's a very, there are going to be people in your area, inevitably, who are also looking for a faithful church. So if someone starts one, then all of a sudden you have people interested in coming and getting a church. You just have to find a way to reach them, right? And so ultimately this is encouraging to me, because it's, like I said, it's harder and harder and harder, I realize, every year to actually find a faithful church, because there is so much capitulation to the corruption in our culture with churches these days. But it is possible. So don't give up finding a good church, but also don't compromise, because every amount of compromise allows a little more of that corruption into whatever church you're going to. If you are going to a church and you see these bad things happening, don't just say, in the name of Christian unity, I'm not going to say anything. If it's actually a big deal, you have to say something in the name of Christian unity, right? So I was encouraged by that this year I have actually found a faithful church, and it's great. I mean, it's so good. I didn't even think it was possible. We were to the point where we were ready absolutely to give up looking for a church. But we found one, and I think so can you. And if you can't, then start one. I was to that point too, we're just going to give up, and one day, whenever I have an opportunity, I'm going to start a church of my own. And I've tried to have Bible studies in the house and things, and it hasn't worked out so far, but I think that's a good thing, because now that I've found a faithful church, we get to go to this church. So it's great. It's wonderful. So hopefully these things have been helpful to you, and you can carry some of the wisdom that I have learned with you as well into the new year. And hopefully it'll be helpful to you as well. God bless, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year. I'll catch you next time.